Boy ran to the cop and said, "He's following me again." What the surveillance cameras revealed was terrifying. The sun was high in the afternoon sky, casting a golden hue over the entire park. It was a familiar scene, a peaceful one that the neighborhood had come to expect, with families scattered across the grassy expanse, their voices mingling with the occasional chirp of birds and the distant hum of city life. The smell of freshly cut grass hung in the air, the kind of scent that evoked memories of lazy summer days, where time seemed to slow and the world felt a little bit lighter. Officer Harris had walked this route dozens of times. He had grown used to the rhythms of the park, the sounds of children playing on the swing set, the occasional bark of a dog off in the distance, and the soft shuffle of joggers, feet along the winding paths. It was a routine patrol, one that he enjoyed, especially on days like today when the weather was so perfect. You'd think nothing bad could ever happen here. But that serene normalcy was about to be shattered. He had just rounded the bend near the duck pond, where old Mr. Peters was tossing breadcrumbs to a gaggle of ducks, when he noticed something out of place. From the far end of the park, just beyond the playground, a small figure was sprinting toward him. It was a boy, no older than 9 or 10, and even from a distance, Officer Harris could tell something was wrong. The way the boy ran, arms pumping furiously, head glancing back over his shoulder every few steps, it wasn't the playful dash of a child in a game of tag. It was the frantic sprint of someone running from something or someone. As the boy drew nearer, Harris recognized him. It was Tommy, the quiet, reserved kid who often sat by himself on one of the park's benches, reading or sketching in a small notebook. Tommy wasn't the type to run around wildly like the other kids. He was shy, introverted. This made his current state of panic all the more alarming. "Officer! Officer!" Tommy's voice was high-pitched and breathless, cracking with fear as he skidded to a halt in front of Harris. His face flushed red from the exertion. His chest heaved as he struggled to catch his breath, his small hands clutching at his knees as he bent over, gasping for air. "Whoa! Easy there, Tommy," Harris said, kneeling down to the boy's level, his tone gentle but firm. "What's going on? Are you hurt?" Tommy shook his head furiously, his eyes wide and darting back toward the path he had just come from. The look in his eyes was one Harris had seen before, pure, unfiltered terror. His face was pale, save for the flush of exertion, and there was a slight tremble in his hands that told Harris this wasn't just the overactive imagination of a young boy. Something had scared Tommy, and it had scared him badly. He's following me again," Tommy blurted out, his words tumbling over each other in his haste to get them out. His voice wavered, on the verge of tears, and he took a step closer to Harris as though seeking protection. Harris's stomach knotted. "Who's following you, Tommy?" he asked, keeping his voice calm, though his mind was already racing through possible scenarios. Could it be a bully from school? A stranger? Tommy swallowed hard, glancing over his shoulder again, as if the act of naming his pursuer might summon them into existence. "I don't know his name," Tommy whispered, "but I keep seeing him, at the park, at school, even outside my house. He's always there, watching me." Harris felt a chill run down his spine. This was no passing panic attack. Tommy was genuinely scared. His small hands clenched the fabric of his shorts, and his breathing was still uneven, shallow. Harris stood, looking around the park, his trained eyes scanning the crowd for anyone who looked out of place. Joggers, families, couples lounging on picnic blankets. Everyone seemed to be minding their own business, lost in their own little worlds. But Harris had been on the force long enough to know that danger didn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it lurked in the background, unnoticed until it was too late. "I don't see anyone right now," Harris said, his voice measured. He didn't want to dismiss Tommy's fears, but he also didn't want to alarm him unnecessarily. "Where did you see him last?" Tommy pointed shakily toward the entrance of the park, where the tree-lined path curved out of sight. Back there, he was standing by the trees, just watching me. Officer Harris narrowed his eyes, scanning the tree line. From where they stood, the path was partially obscured by a thick cluster of trees and bushes, casting deep shadows on the ground beneath them. Anyone could be standing there, hidden just out of sight. His instincts kicked in. Tommy wasn't the type of kid to make up stories for attention, and the fear in his eyes wasn't something Harris could ignore. "All right, Tommy," Harris said, straightening up. "Let's get you out of here, okay? We'll head to the station, and I'll have someone take a look around." Tommy hesitated, glancing back toward the trees one more time, his small body trembling. "But what if he follows us?" Harris crouched down again, placing a reassuring hand on Tommy's shoulder. "Listen to me, Tommy. You're safe with me. No one's going to hurt you. We'll figure this out. Okay?" Tommy nodded slowly, his fear still evident but slightly tempered by the officer's steady presence. Harris led him toward the patrol car parked at the edge of the park, his eyes still scanning the tree line. As they walked, Harris couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Every instinct in his body told him that something was wrong, but there was no obvious threat, no shadowy figure lurking in the bushes, no suspicious faces among the park-goers. Still, he couldn't ignore the gnawing sensation in his gut. Whatever, or whoever, had scared Tommy might still be out there, just beyond sight. They reached the car, and Harris opened the door for Tommy, who scrambled into the back seat, still glancing nervously over his shoulder. Harris climbed into the driver's seat, his mind already working through the next steps. He'd take Tommy to the station, get more details from him, and maybe pull some surveillance footage from around the park and his school. If there really was someone following the boy, they'd find him. As they pulled away from the park, Harris glanced in the rearview mirror, catching a glimpse of Tommy staring out the window, his face still etched with fear. "You're doing the right thing, Tommy," Harris said, trying to reassure him. "We'll get to the bottom of this, I promise." But as they drove, the uneasy feeling in Harris's gut only grew. He had seen fear before, real fear. It was in the way Tommy kept looking back over his shoulder, the way his hands shook, the way his voice trembled when he talked about the man who was following him. This wasn't just a case of a child's imagination running wild. Something had frightened Tommy deeply, and Harris wasn't about to dismiss it. Tommy sat in the back seat of the patrol car, his small hands fidgeting in his lap as they drove through the quiet streets of the neighborhood. The sun was beginning to dip toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the road, and Tommy couldn't help but glance nervously out the window every few seconds, as though expecting the figure to suddenly appear from behind a parked car or step out of an alleyway. Officer Harris noticed the boy's restless movements in the rearview mirror. He knew that fear had a way of amplifying everything, turning every shadow into a potential threat, every passing glance into a sinister plot. But there was something about Tommy's fear that struck Harris as more than just a child's overactive imagination. "How long has this been going on, Tommy?" Harris asked, breaking the heavy silence that had settled in the car. Tommy bit his lip, staring out the window. "About a week," he said softly. "Maybe longer." "I don't know." "And you've seen this man every day?" Tommy nodded. "At school, at the park, even outside my house. He's always there, just watching me." Harris felt a surge of protectiveness toward the boy. No child should have to live with that kind of fear, constantly looking over their shoulder, wondering if they were being followed. He could only imagine how terrifying it must be for Tommy to feel like he was under constant surveillance, like his every move was being watched by unseen eyes. "Have you told your mom about this?" Harris asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Tommy hesitated, his fingers twisting in the fabric of his shirt. "I told her, but she doesn't believe me. She thinks I'm just imagining things." Harris sighed inwardly. It wasn't uncommon for parents to dismiss their children's fears, especially when those fears seemed irrational or unfounded. But he could see how deeply this was affecting Tommy. The boy's face was pale, his eyes wide with worry, and there was a haunted look in his gaze that spoke of sleepless nights and too many hours spent waiting for something bad to happen. "We'll talk to her when we get to the station," Harris said, trying to sound reassuring. "For now, let's just focus on keeping you safe." Tommy didn't respond, but he continued to glance out the window, his body tense with anxiety. Harris kept his eyes on the road, but his mind was already working through the possibilities. Was this a case of a child misinterpreting random encounters with strangers? Or was there something more sinister at play? Either way, Harris knew he couldn't take any chances. He had seen too many cases where seemingly harmless situations had escalated into something far worse. And if Tommy really was being followed, they needed to act fast before anything happened. They pulled up to the station, the building's familiar brick facade bathed in the soft glow of the setting sun. Harris parked the car and opened the door for Tommy, who climbed out slowly, still casting furtive glances over his shoulder. Inside the station, the atmosphere was busy but not chaotic. Officers were filing reports, phones rang in the background, and the low murmur of voices filled the air. Harris led Tommy to a small office near the back, away from the hustle and bustle of the main floor. He wanted the boy to feel safe, to feel like he was being taken seriously. "Wait here for a moment," Harris said, motioning for Tommy to sit down at the small desk in the corner of the room. The boy obeyed, sinking into the chair with a weary sigh. Harris stepped out of the office and made his way to the front desk, where a familiar face greeted him. "Hey, Harris," said Officer Parker, a young woman with a sharp wit and an even sharper eye for detail. "What's up?" "I've got a situation," Harris replied, keeping his voice low. "There's a boy in my office, Tommy. He's convinced someone's been following him for the past week." Parker raised an eyebrow. "Following him? Like stalking him?" Harris nodded grimly. "That's what it sounds like. He's scared out of his mind." Parker frowned, her expression turning serious. "You think there's any truth to it?" "I don't know yet," Harris admitted, "but I'm not going to ignore it. I'm going to pull some surveillance footage from around the park and his school, see if anything looks suspicious." Parker nodded. "Good idea. I'll get started on that." As Parker went to work, Harris returned to the office where Tommy sat, his hands still clenched in his lap. The boy looked up as Harris entered, his eyes filled with unspoken questions. "What's going to happen now?" Tommy asked, his voice small and uncertain. Harris smiled gently, trying to put the boy at ease. "We're going to take a look at some camera footage, see if we can spot this man you've been seeing. In the meantime, I want you to stay here where it's safe, okay?" Tommy nodded, but the fear in his eyes remained. Harris's mind raced as he left the room again, heading toward the surveillance room where Parker was already pulling up the footage. His gut told him there was more to this than met the eye. Whether it was a stranger with malicious intent or simply a case of mistaken identity, he had to find out the truth. Tommy's safety depended on it. As Officer Harris guided Tommy into the small office at the station, he couldn't help but notice how small and vulnerable the boy looked, slouched in the chair, his legs swinging just above the floor. The room was quiet, almost sterile, save for the soft hum of a fan rotating in the corner. The plain white walls and sparse furnishings did little to provide comfort, but it was the safest place Officer Harris could think of for Tommy at the moment. Still, the boy's hands gripped the edge of the chair tightly, and his eyes, wide with worry, darted toward every sound that echoed from the hallway outside. "I'm going to call your mom, okay?" Officer Harris said gently, pulling up a chair beside him. "She'll be here soon." Tommy didn't say anything, but his small head bobbed up and down in a nod. His hands fidgeted with the hem of his shirt, twisting and untwisting the fabric in nervous repetition. It was clear that even here, away from the park and whoever, or whatever, had been watching him, Tommy didn't feel entirely safe. Harris felt a pang of sympathy for the boy. He had seen plenty of kids come through the station over the years, kids who had been caught up in unfortunate situations, from domestic disputes to petty crimes. But there was something about Tommy that tugged at him in a different way. Maybe it was the boy's vulnerability, the way he had been carrying this fear all by himself for days, unsure of who to turn to or how to make it stop. Or maybe it was the way Tommy's eyes seemed to reflect a deep sense of loneliness, a feeling Harris recognized all too well from his own childhood. Either way, Harris was determined to get to the bottom of this. He stepped out of the office and made his way back to the front desk, where Officer Parker was already on the phone, her fingers flying over the keyboard as she pulled up surveillance footage from the cameras near Tommy's school and the park. "Any luck?" Harris asked, leaning against the desk. Parker glanced up, shaking her head. "Not yet. I've only gone through today's footage so far, but I'll keep looking. If there's someone hanging around, we'll find him." Harris nodded, his mind already racing through potential next steps. He needed more information. He needed to know what Tommy's mother knew. It wasn't uncommon for parents to miss signs of distress in their children, especially when the fear seemed irrational or unfounded. But Tommy's fear was real. That much was clear. Whether or not there was an actual stalker, something was scaring this boy, and Harris needed to understand the full picture. He picked up the phone and dialed Carla's number, the digits ingrained in his memory from the countless times he had seen her walking Tommy home from school. She picked up on the second ring, her voice breathless and slightly panicked. "Officer Harris, is Tommy okay? I got your message. I'm on my way now." "Tommy's fine," Harris assured her. "He's here at the station with me. He's safe, but I think we need to talk about what's been going on." There was a pause on the other end of the line, a hesitation that told Harris this wasn't the first time Carla had heard about Tommy's fears. "Is it about what he's been saying?" she asked, her voice tinged with uncertainty. "About the man following him?" "Yes," Harris replied. "He's pretty shaken up. We're looking into it, but I'd like to hear more from you when you get here." "How long has he been talking about this?" Carla sighed, and Harris could hear the exhaustion in her voice. "It started about a week ago. He came home from school one day and said there was a man outside, just standing by the corner, watching him. I thought maybe he'd seen someone passing by and gotten spooked, but then it happened again, at the park, and outside the house. He keeps saying this man is following him." Harris's grip tightened on the phone. "And have you seen anyone? Anyone unusual hanging around?" "No," Carla admitted, her voice wavering. "I haven't seen anyone. That's why I thought maybe it was just in his head. You know how kids can be. They hear things, they see things, and their minds run wild." "I understand," Harris said, trying to sound reassuring. "But Tommy seems genuinely frightened. We're going to investigate, pull some footage from around his school and the park, just to be sure. In the meantime, it might be a good idea to keep a closer eye on him. Don't let him walk anywhere alone." "I should have done that already," Carla said, guilt seeping into her voice. I didn't realize it was this serious. He's been having trouble sleeping, too. I thought maybe it was just stress from school." Harris's chest tightened with a mix of sympathy and concern. It was easy to overlook small signs: trouble sleeping, mood swings, a child's claim of seeing something scary. But when those small signs added up, they could point to something much bigger. "I'll be there in 10 minutes, Carla said, her voice determined now. "Thank you, Officer Harris." Harris hung up the phone and took a deep breath. He had a feeling this was going to be more complicated than it seemed. Parents often struggled with the line between overprotectiveness and giving their children independence. It was natural to want to dismiss certain fears as overblown, especially when they didn't make sense at first glance. But Tommy's fear wasn't just a passing phase, and Harris couldn't shake the feeling that something darker was at play. When Carla arrived at the station, she rushed in, her face flushed with worry. She was a petite woman in her early 30s, with tired eyes and a frazzled demeanor that spoke of long days and sleepless nights. Her hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, and she clutched her purse tightly against her chest as she approached Harris. "Where is he?" she asked breathlessly, scanning the room. "He's in the office," Harris said, leading her down the hall. "He's a little shaken up, but he's okay." Carla's eyes softened as she stepped into the room and saw Tommy sitting in the chair, his small frame curled up as though trying to make himself invisible. She rushed to his side, kneeling down in front of him and pulling him into a tight hug. "Oh, sweetie," she whispered, brushing a strand of hair out of his face. "I'm so sorry. I didn't know it was this bad." Tommy buried his face in her shoulder, and for a moment, the two of them stayed like that, locked in a silent embrace. Harris stood back, giving them a moment of privacy. But as he watched, he couldn't help but feel a growing sense of urgency. Tommy's fear was real, and now it was up to Harris to figure out what was causing it. After a few moments, Carla pulled away slightly, looking up at Harris with teary eyes. "What do we do now?" Harris pulled up a chair and sat down across from them, his voice calm but firm. "I'm going to have a team review the surveillance footage from around Tommy's school and the park. If there's someone hanging around, we'll find them. In the meantime, I want you to keep Tommy close. Don't let him walk home alone, and make sure he's with someone you trust when he's outside." Carla nodded, her hands still clutching Tommy's shoulders. "I will. I can't believe I didn't see this sooner." "It's not your fault," Harris said gently. "Kids can be hard to read sometimes. The important thing is that we're taking this seriously now. Tommy looked up from his mother's shoulder, his face pale but his eyes determined. Is he going to come back? He asked, his voice small and trembling. We're going to make sure that doesn't happen, Harris promised. But you did the right thing by telling me, Tommy. You're safe now. Carla's expression softened as she looked down at her son, her heart breaking at the sight of his fear. We'll get through this, she said, her voice thick with emotion. You're brave, Tommy. Harris watched the interaction with a mixture of hope and concern. They were doing everything they could to keep Tommy safe, but there was still so much they didn't know. Who was this man? Why was he following Tommy? And what did he want? As the hours ticked by, Harris found himself more and more determined to uncover the truth. He had seen too many cases where things had been dismissed as a child's imagination, only for something far more dangerous to be lurking beneath the surface. Tommy's fear was real, and until they had answers, Harris wasn't going to rest. Officer Harris moved swiftly through the station, his mind churning with the weight of what was unfolding. After Tommy and Carla had settled in the small office, Harris returned to the surveillance room, where Officer Parker was hunched over the monitors, her face bathed in the pale glow of the screens. The low hum of the machinery filled the room, a constant reminder of the quiet work happening behind the scenes. Anything yet? Harris asked as he stepped inside, his voice low but filled with urgency. Parker sighed, leaning back in her chair and rubbing her eyes. I've been combing through the footage from the park, but it's a lot of data. People come and go, kids run in and out of the frame. It's tough to pinpoint anything specific. Harris nodded, though his chest tightened with frustration. He had hoped there would be something obvious, some clear sign of who or what was making Tommy feel so afraid. But the reality was that surveillance footage was rarely that cooperative. People moved in and out of the frame, sometimes appearing for only a split second before disappearing again. It was like trying to piece together a puzzle when half the pieces were missing. Still, Harris wasn't ready to give up. Let's focus on the times Tommy mentioned, he suggested. He said he saw this man at the park after school, so maybe we can narrow it down to those hours. Parker nodded, her fingers already flying across the keyboard as she adjusted the time settings on the footage. The grainy black and white images flickered across the screen as the cameras switched between different angles of the park. One focused on the playground, another on the path leading in and out of the park, and a third capturing the open field where families often picnicked. For several minutes, there was nothing. Just the usual hustle and bustle of a public park. Children playing, joggers passing by, a few people walking their dogs. But then, something caught Harris's eye. There, he said sharply, leaning forward and pointing to the far corner of the screen. Pause it. Parker froze the footage, and they both stared at the monitor, their eyes locked on the shadowy figure standing just at the edge of the frame. It was difficult to make out any details. The figure was partially obscured by the branches of a tree, and they were standing far enough away that their features were blurred, but there was no mistaking it. Someone was there. Harris leaned in closer to the screen, studying the figure that stood in the shadow of the tree. The person was mostly hidden, with only the outline of their body barely visible from the angle of the camera. They stood still, almost too still, as if watching something or someone from a distance. The figure was dressed in dark clothing, possibly a hoodie or a jacket with the hood pulled up, which only added to their air of anonymity. The darkness of the clothing blended into the surrounding foliage, making it difficult to distinguish where the figure ended and the shadows began. Parker zoomed in, trying to get a clearer view, but the grainy resolution of the footage made it impossible to see any identifying details. The figure remained frustratingly vague, like a ghost caught on film, present but unrecognizable. That's him, isn't it? Parker asked, glancing over at Harris. Harris nodded slowly, his jaw tight. It could be. It matches Tommy's description. A man, standing off at a distance, watching. But why here? Why Tommy? Parker rewound the footage slightly and played it again, her eyes scanning the rest of the park to see if anyone else was paying attention to the figure. But as the camera panned over the playground and picnic areas, it became clear that no one had noticed the person lingering by the trees. People walked by, Joggers continued their routines. Children played without a care in the world. The figure remained hidden in plain sight, an unnoticed presence that only Tommy seemed to be aware of. "Doesn't look like anyone else saw him," Parker muttered, her fingers tapping rhythmically on the desk. "He's staying far enough back to avoid drawing attention." Harris frowned, his mind racing. "I don't like this. If this guy has been hanging around for days, how has no one else reported him? It doesn't make sense." Parker shrugged, but there was a hint of unease in her expression. Maybe people just didn't notice. Or maybe they did notice but didn't think it was suspicious. I mean, it's a public park. There are always people hanging around. He could have easily blended in. Harris ran a hand over his face, feeling the weight of the situation pressing down on him. Blending in was one thing, but deliberately lurking in the shadows, watching a child from a distance, was something else entirely. Whoever this person was, they were going to great lengths to remain unnoticed, until Tommy caught on. And now, Harris was beginning to understand why the boy had been so terrified. "We need to keep looking," Harris said, his voice tense. "Let's see if we can find him anywhere else. Maybe we can get a better angle from another camera." Parker nodded and began pulling up footage from different cameras around the park. Starting from the day Tommy had first mentioned seeing the man, they watched the footage in silence, their eyes scanning the screens for any sign of the mysterious figure. Hours of footage rolled by, people walking their dogs, families gathering for picnics, teenagers hanging out on the benches, but nothing out of the ordinary. And then, just as they were about to switch to a new angle, the figure appeared again. "There he is," Parker said, freezing the footage. Same spot as before, but a different day. Harris's stomach clenched as he stared at the screen. The figure was standing in the same place, just off the path, hidden in the shade of the trees. The angle was slightly better this time, and they could make out more of the person's silhouette. It was a man, that much was clear, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing what looked like a dark hoodie with the hood pulled up over his head. He wasn't doing anything, just standing there, watching. But that stillness, that sense of quiet observation, sent a chill down Harris's spine. "He's following a pattern," Harris said, more to himself than to Parker. "He's always in the same area, watching Tommy. But why? What's his goal?" Parker rewound the footage again and played it in slow motion, trying to capture every detail. "Maybe he's just waiting for the right moment," she suggested, her voice low. He could be planning something. The thought made Harris's blood run cold. He didn't want to jump to conclusions, but the longer they watched the footage, the more convinced he became that this man wasn't just a random passerby. He had a reason for being there, a purpose for watching Tommy. But what that purpose was remained frustratingly out of reach. "Can we get a clearer shot of his face?" Harris asked, leaning forward in his seat. "There's got to be another angle that gives us more to work with." Parker shook her head, her frustration evident. "The resolution on these cameras isn't great. Even if we zoom in, it's too grainy to make out any real details. We'd need a much closer shot to get a positive ID." Harris cursed under his breath. They had found the man, but they were still no closer to identifying him. Whoever he was, he knew how to stay hidden. He knew how to avoid the cameras and keep his face out of sight. It was almost as if he had planned it this way, as if he knew exactly how to move through the park without being noticed. "We need to alert patrols in the area," Harris said, standing up and grabbing his phone. "If this guy is hanging around Tommy's school in the park, there's a good chance he'll show up again. We need to keep an eye on the area and catch him in the act." Parker nodded, her expression serious. "I'll put out the word. We'll have extra officers on the lookout." As Harris dialed the number for his superior, his mind raced with possibilities. He had dealt with stalkers before, people who fixated on their victims, watching them from afar, waiting for the right moment to make their move. But this felt different. There was something more calculated about this man, something more deliberate, and the fact that Tommy had been the only one to notice him made Harris wonder if the boy had been specifically targeted. Why Tommy? Harris wondered as the phone rang. What made him stand out to this guy? The questions gnawed at him, but he knew he wouldn't find the answers until they caught the man. And until then, he would do everything in his power to keep Tommy